Welcome to Mercy Baptist Church, and we're having Sunday school lesson. I'm in Sunday school class, and we're nearing the end. Next week will be the end of the book of Job, but we're nearing the end. We're going to be in Job chapters, kind of skipping along from chapter 38 through chapter 41 of Job. And hopefully we won't have the audio problems we did last week. We actually have somebody in the sound room this week to monitor it and help compensate just in case we have issues. But before we get started, we need to go to the Lord in prayer. So let's go ahead and ask the Lord His blessing on this lesson. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you again for your love, your mercy, and grace, Father. And Lord, we just pray that you'd minister this morning, Lord, through this Sunday school lesson. I pray that you'd open our eyes and our hearts and minds, Father, and help us to understand, Lord, what you have for us here. And help us to use it, Lord, to learn more about you and how we need to love you and just trust you, Father, that you know what you're doing. So all these things we ask in the precious name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, so throughout the book of Job, or at least the part, I'm hearing a ring. I did adjust the gain a little bit, so maybe the gain's a little too high. But anyway, Job, every time he has spoken here after his friends came and started talking to him, he has been wishing for an audience with God. And here he gets his wish in this chapter. Well, starting from 38 through 41, he gets his wish because God actually speaks to him. And God is going to inform Job, basically that Job has been talking about things that he knows nothing about. It's kind of like as what we would say nowadays. We'd say, oh, well, it's above my pay grade. Well, he's been talking about things that's been above his pay grade. And God's going to ask Job a series of questions that's designed to show him how little he knows and how little he is compared to God. And really, this lesson should humble anyone, ourselves or anybody else who would believe that they are in a position to be able to advise God in what he's doing, to correct God, to critique God in what he does, of how he administers the universe and his creation. So we're going to start in that first verse of Job 38. Now, Elihu has just got finished speaking, and then the Lord immediately starts talking. Job 38 verse 1 says, Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. So first it says, Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Now, like I said, Job had been wishing for an audience. He'd wish he could talk to God and get God to explain why is it that he's been suffering so much, because he couldn't come up with any kind of reason on his own. Because as far as he was concerned, he had done nothing wrong. Job 31:35 is an example of this, because there Job says, Oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me, and that mine adversary had written a book. So he was wishing that God would explain why in the world he was suffering the way he was. So now God does answer him, but he answers him out of the whirlwind. The Hebrew word for whirlwind refers to a tempest or a storm. And things like clouds, thunders, and lightnings is typically associated or are often associated with God's presence in the Bible. And so it's from this scenario, it's like so that Job knows that, oh, this is God speaking. So God's answering out of the whirlwind. And his first statement, he says, and said, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? The word for darkeneth means to dim or to hide. And of course the word by knowledge means perception or understanding. And so Job and his friends have been speaking about things that they don't understand. These are words without knowledge. They were saying a lot of things, but they were saying things without the knowledge to back them up, for them to be able to speak the correct words. And so, and they were doing just like we human beings. We always love to express our opinion because we think we know what's going on. We think we know better than other people do. And so he says, God says, who is this that darkeneth counsel? They thought they were illuminating the situation with their words, but instead they were darkening it. Darkening counsel. They were, the counsel is like advice or understanding what's going on. He says, look, you guys think you were illuminating it, and instead you were darkening it because of your limited understanding and your misguided ideas, because they were basing their ideas on what they thought they knew about how God did things. So then God tells Job, he says, gird up now thy loins like a man. Now back in those days, men wear robes. And so if they needed to do something that required some sort of physical exertion, like running or working or fighting, they would bind up the robes so that their robes wouldn't encumber their movements, so they'd be free to move to do whatever they needed to do. And so God's basically saying, hey, gird up your loins, like we might say, hey, cinch up your belt, get yourself ready. And then he says, like a man. And to do something like a man, implies doing it courageously. So God's basically saying, all right, Job, you better cinch up your belt, put your big boy pants on, because we're about to go on a ride. What you're about to engage in is going to push you to your limits. So you better be ready. Gird up your loins and be ready. Do it like a man. You better step up. You've been talking the talk. Now it's time for you to walk the walk. It's basically. And he says, for I will demand of you. In other words, I'm going to ask you questions. He says, and answer thou me. So he's going to ask Job a series of questions. And he says, look, you're going to answer me to the best of your ability. And as we're going to see, the intent of these questions is to show that Job is not as smart as he thinks he is. That mankind is not as smart as they are. They're not as powerful as they think they are. So verse 4, first question. God says, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? He says, declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? All right, so he says, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? And he says, declare if you have understanding. And obviously Job was not even born when God created the earth, which shows that Job is a mortal. He has finite existence. He has a short lifespan. And so he couldn't have participated in God's creation. He couldn't have been there to serve as an advisor. He couldn't even been there to be an observer to see what was going on. So God says, look, Job, where were you when all this was happening? When I created the earth? And I like watching these science shows on TV, but I always have to shake my head because they declare with such authority that, oh, well, so many millions of years ago this happened, and so many millions of years ago that happened. You know, and they say it with such authority like they know. But I know that none of them were alive when that happened. For them to know that, oh, so many millions of years that this X or Y happened. I mean, they're basing, they're having to guess and make theories based on flawed assumptions because they assume that that God created, or that they assume that the universe came about by natural forces, natural things that happened, and so we don't need God. You know, they assume that God didn't create the universe, and they're also basing it on incomplete evidence because they're constantly saying, "Oh, you know, we believe this way," but then whenever then we discovered this, and it totally turned upside down what we thought we knew about such and such. I mean, they're constantly doing that. I mean, man is just not as smart and doesn't have the knowledge that he thinks that he has. So God says, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the word? He says, declare or tell me if you've got understanding. And of course, Job can't reply to that. Then he says, who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest, or who hath stretched the line upon it? See, he's using the metaphor of building a house. You know, I laid the foundations, and now he says, who hath laid the measures thereof? You know, and any builder knows, you know, you got to measure your stuff, you know, the materials before you can, you know, if you need to build a wall, you know, you got to cut the 2x4s a certain length, and I mean, you have to measure everything. And so God's asking Job, says, who laid the measures thereof, or who has stretched a line, you know, a measuring line on it? He says, you know, do you even know anything about how all this was done, Job? And of course, Job can't answer that either. Then he says, verse 6, he says, whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened, or who hath laid the cornerstone thereof, when the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy? So he says, look, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? You know, do you understand how the measures of how everything was built? And then he says, and whereupon are the foundations of the earth fastened? You know, how is it put? You know, what's holding the earth in place? Basically, is what he's saying. Or who laid the cornerstone? See, he's still using that building metaphor, and so he's letting Job know that he has no clue as to what's holding the earth where it is. Anything about how the cornerstone, how it was laid, or who laid it. I mean, obviously God laid it, but he says, look, Job, you have no clue what you've been talking about. Now, today we have a little better understanding, you know, about gravity and centrifugal force and orbits of planets and stuff like that. We know a little more than what Job did, but when you compare that to how this universe is really put together, we know still a very minuscule bit about how this universe operates. God has 100% total understanding, but mankind doesn't. Then he says, when the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy, he says, do you know how the earth, I created the earth and I hung it I'm saying hung it in space. God didn't come out and say that, but he says, this was when the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy. So apparently the angels celebrated the creation of the earth, for the glory of God. And so not only was Job not there when all this was happening, God mentions the angels, who are obviously better informed. They are greater in power and intelligence and all that stuff. He says, look, Job, they were there even though you weren't. And so, you got God, and then you got angels, and then you got mankind. Angels are created beings just as well as man, but Job, he's putting Job in his place. He says, look, Job, you think you know enough that you can advise me, tell me how I should be doing things? Well, you're even below the angels. In fact, there's a verse that says, what is man that thou art mindful of him, because you've created him a little lower than the angels? He's saying, look, Job, that even the angels, they were there and they're celebrating, and you were not there, and so you're way down the totem pole, as it were. All right, so now our lesson skips to chapter 40. The remainder of chapter 38 and through the chapter 39, God continues asking Job these questions about the creation, testing his understanding of how things work, as well as Job's ability to manage the creation the way God does it. So we get to chapter 40. Now, the first 5 verses, God asks if anyone who disagrees with him, whether or not they have the qualifications to instruct him. And then Job does briefly respond, and he admits that he has no answers to the questions that God's been asking, and he realizes how small and insignificant it is. So we come to verse 6 of chapter 40. And so it says, and then God answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind, and said, gird up thy loins now like a man, and I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. So God is not finished. He's ready to ask him another series of questions. So he tells Job, he says, you better gird up your loins, you better get ready, because here we go again. And so in verse 8, he picks up there and he says, wilt thou disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me, that thou mayest be righteous? So that first phrase, he says, wilt thou disannul my judgment? That word disannul means to break or to frustrate. It's basically, it's kind of like when the president, like the Congress, they pass a bill or they come up with something or other, and then the president has the ability to veto it. Well, here he's basically saying, do you, Job, have the ability to veto my judgment, or to break it, or disregard it, or cancel it? What I have decided to do. Judgment means making a decision. So he says, Job, the things I decide to do, how I cause things to happen in this world, he says, do you think you're able to frustrate or break or cancel my decisions? And how arrogant is it of man? I mean, a lot of people, Christians and non-Christians alike, they think, and they may not come out and actually say it, but I think it's reflected in our attitude sometimes. We think, well, God, you shouldn't have done it this way. You should have done it the other way. Why did you allow Hitler to do, get by with all the things that he did? God did eventually destroy Hitler. But I'm sure while they were going through it, people were asking, Lord, why are you allowing this to continue? Why are you not punishing Hitler? Because he so deserves, your judgment. But, we, as we're going to see through this, this entire book, I think the entire book, the theme is God does as he chooses to do, and we are not in a position to question what God does, but we trust that what he does is the correct thing and the wise thing to do. So he says, wilt thou disannul my judgment? And then he says, wilt thou condemn me, that thou mayest be righteous? If we're arrogant enough to think that, well, God, you did this wrong. You shouldn't have done it that way. You should have done it this way. We're basically condemning him. We're questioning his righteousness. We're condemning his, his wisdom or his intelligence. And say, Lord, my opinion, I think you should have done X, but instead you did Y. Therefore, and we may not even come out and say it, but I think it's implied in our attitudes is that, God, I wish you had done it this way. If you'd come and asked me, I would have told you to do it that way. But how arrogant can we be to condemn God and say, God, you made a mistake. You did something wrong. And thereby implying that we're the righteous one because, in our opinion, he should have done this, but instead he did that. And therefore, we must be the one who is right because God made the mistake. I mean, that is just... And so he's asking Job this as almost or pretty much as a rhetorical question. So he says, wilt thou condemn me that thou mayest be righteous? Are you going to tell me that I was wrong and therefore I should have listened to you and done what you wanted? That's arrogant and foolish to be able to think that. Then God continues, verse 9. He says, hast thou an arm like God? Or canst thou thunder with a voice like him? Deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, and array thyself with glory and beauty. So he asks the question, he says, hast thou an arm like God? And canst thou thunder with a voice like him? An arm was a symbol of strength. You talk about like the arm of the Lord or something. It's your strength. In fact, I remember back in school, if you wanted to gauge your strength against your buddy, what would you do? You sit down there and arm wrestle. It's like if you got a strong arm, that means you're strong. And so God's asking Job. He says, do you have an arm like God? Like, are you as powerful and as strong as God? Or canst thou thunder with a voice like him? Do you have a thunderous voice like God? He's saying, Job, do you really think you're strong like God? And so he says, if you are, then he says, if you are that strong, he says, then deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, and array thyself with glory and beauty. God is powerful, and he clothes himself with majesty and excellency, glory and beauty. And so he says, look, Job, if you're strong like me, then you should be able to do this as well. Well, what was Job's situation right then? He's sitting there covered head to toe with boils, painful boils. And so he wasn't able to change a thing. He wasn't able to clothe himself with majesty and excellency, glory and beauty. Then he says, verse 11, he says, cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and behold everyone that is proud, and abase him. Look on everyone that is proud, and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together, and bind their faces in secret. Then will I confess unto thee that thine own right hand can save thee. So he says, look, hey Job, if you're strong, if you're that strong, he says, then you should be able to cast abroad the rage of your wrath, and behold everyone that is proud, and abase him. Abase means to bring down, to bring low, to humble somebody. And so he says, look, you should be able to do like I do, because when there are proud people that are proud, they exalt themselves against me. He says, I'm able to abase them, to humble them, to bring them down. He says, so you should be able to do it. He says, look on everyone that is proud, bring him low, and he says, tread down the wicked in their place. So he says, you should be able to deal with the wicked people just like I do, and bring them down, and keep them from exalting themselves. Then he says, hide them in the dust together, and bind their faces in secret. He says, I'm able to humble them to where they fall down on their face. They hide them in the dust together. That seems to be speaking of them falling prostrate on the ground with their faces in the dirt. They've been humbled by that, and that binding their faces in secret. That may mean for them, hiding their face because they're face down on the ground. It could also mean hiding their faces in secret possibly in the grave or even in hell. But he's saying, look, are you able to humble the proud like this? Are you strong enough that you can do that? He says, if you are, he says, then will I also confess unto thee that thine own right hand can save thee. So he says, look, if you're able to do all these things, you're well able to take care of yourself. He says, then I will confess, I'll admit to you that you are, that you can by your own right hand, that you are able to help yourself and to deliver yourself out of all your sufferings that you're doing, that you can save yourself. But of course, Job is unable to do this. He's sitting there in the ash pit the ash pile with the covered head to toe with sores. Everything he's had is gone. If he was powerful like God, he could restore all that. He could heal himself, and he'd have no more troubles. But it's obvious that Job is powerless. He cannot do that. All right. So verses 15 through 24, through the rest of this chapter, our lesson jumps over to chapter 41. But in the remainder of this chapter, God continues by calling on Job to consider Behemoth, a powerful animal that God has created. Now, since translators couldn't identify what animal this is, to translate it, like if it was a dog, then they would say, we'd have the English word dog, but because it's the word behemoth, the Hebrew word is behemoth, and so they just basically transliterated it because they don't know what animal it is, so they transliterated it and just basically made an English word that sounded just like the Hebrew word. And there's, we don't know what animal this is for sure. There have been many theories, like an elephant or a dinosaur. But apparently God's point here is that, look, I created this animal. He's more powerful than you. And so where does that put you, Job? You can't do anything with Behemoth, and therefore your strength compared to my strength is, I obviously tip the scales overwhelmingly in my direction. So we come to chapter 41, first verse. And now God brings up another animal. He says, canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? Canst thou put a hook into his nose, or bore his jaw through with a thorn? So now he's talking about Leviathan, and this is another unknown animal whose name has been transliterated from Hebrew to English. The English word Leviathan, the Hebrew word is very close to Leviathan. It's, all they did was basically take the sounds and make an English word out of it, or do it as best they could with English phonetics and letters in our alphabet. And suggestions for the identity of Leviathan include animals such as a crocodile or a whale or even an aquatic dinosaur. And a dinosaur seems to be the closest thing, fitting description found throughout this chapter. Although in verses 19 through 21 it seems to be talking about how this animal can breathe fire, which seems to be beyond anything that any natural creature that we know of. But God's asking Job, he says, look, can you, this Leviathan creature, are you able to pull him out of the water like you would a fish on a hook? Can you put a hook into his nose? Can you pull him out with a tongue, with a or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down, or bore his jaw through with a thorn. He says, look, are you able to, we can pull a fish out of the water easy because we're much stronger than a fish. But he says, can you do that same thing with Leviathan? Then he says, verse 3, he says, will he make supplications unto thee? Will he speak soft words unto thee? Will he make a covenant with thee? And wilt thou make him for a servant forever? Wilt thou play with him as with a bird? Or wilt thou bind him for thy maidens? So here he's making the point of how weak and how small and insignificant that Job's strength really is. So he says, will he make many supplications unto thee? And will he speak soft words unto thee? If you caught a fish, if that fish could talk to you, he'd be pleading with you and say, hey, please let me go. I'll do anything. I'll make a deal with you or whatever. And so he said, will he make supplications unto thee? Are you able to draw Leviathan out of the water and have him so intimidated that he's going to try to plead with you to let him go, and that he'll speak soft words, like he's going to talk real nice and try to get on your good side? He says, are you powerful? He says, God says, look, I can do this. Can you do this, Job? Then he says, will he make a covenant with thee? In other words, will he make a deal with you, that, if you let me go, I'll be your servant forever? Because that's what he says. He says, will he make a covenant with thee? Wilt thou take him for a servant forever? He says, are you able to do this, Job, that he is so afraid of you that he's going to be willing to make a deal with you if you'll let him live, if you'll let him survive? And then he says, wilt thou play with him as with a bird? It's almost a silly idea that Job as a man can take such a great, powerful creature that apparently is bigger than him, and then be able to play with him like a bird. How like I guess you put a bird in a cage and play with him. He says, look, is he going to become a plaything? Are you strong enough, Job, that you can make a plaything out of Leviathan? And wilt thou bind him for thy maidens? In other words, will you tie him up, or maybe put him on a leash so that your maidens can enjoy him and play with him and such? And these maidens could be female servants or his daughters, but he's saying, look, Job, are you this strong? Are you able to do such a thing? And so, that's all the verses in our lesson. The remainder of the chapter, verses 6 through 34, God continues describing the powerful nature of Leviathan. He talks about the various characteristics and behaviors that cause men to fear it. But God's point seems to be that, hey, if I'm powerful enough to create such a creature as Leviathan, then where does that put you? And men are fearful and unable to control Leviathan. He says, where does that put you, Job? Because man's strength and understanding are insignificant when you compare that to the strength and the intelligence, the understanding, the wisdom of God. And so this whole, these last 4 chapters, 38 through 41, or maybe it's 5 chapters, God is showing Job that, Job, you've been wanting me to explain why you've been suffering. And all I can tell you is Job, trust me, because it's, as we would say it today, it's above your pay grade, Job. Why you're suffering, it's not for me. I'm not going to explain it to you. In fact, if you look through the entire book of Job, as far as we know, never understood. God never explains to him why he had to suffer. But So the whole point of the book seems to be, a lot of people will point to the book of Job and say, oh, the whole point of that is why does God's people suffer? And we get some clues there. We find out why Job suffered. Why each of us suffer, there's probably 1,000,001 different reasons. You might could categorize them as, in groups of things, but the whole point is not why the good people suffer. It's more or less that, yes, we suffer. God allows us to suffer, but we have to trust Him that He knows what He's doing, that He owes us no explanation, and because that's one of the things that, and we'll see that next week when Job does respond to these to this interrogation by God, but is that we don't understand why God allows certain things to happen, but we can trust Him. I remember when Jesus was 40 days in the wilderness. Satan comes to him and he says, "Look, if you're the Son of God, take these stones and turn them into bread." And what did the Lord say? He says, "Get thee behind me, Satan, for man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God, that comes out of the mouth of God." He's basically saying, he says, Job or Satan, I'm submitted to my Father. If He wants me to eat, He'll speak the word, and he'll command it, and I'll have food to eat. If He doesn't want me to eat, then I'm not going to eat because I'm submitted to the will of my Father. And that's the way we need to be. If God allows us to suffer, we say, "Lord, this is your will. I'm just trusting you. If you want to get me out of this, you will. If you want me to endure this for a little longer, then that's what I'll do." But it's the point that God owes us no explanation. He does as He wishes, and we are His servants to do whatever He wants us to do. All right, so next week we'll see Job's response when Job finally realizes, "Oh yeah, I've been wrong. I've looked at this totally wrong, and I've been talking about things that I don't understand." So until then, study the Scripture.